obsessed with something. About 6 months ago, my pilot from World War II and the two gunners, myself and a guy by the name of Dance, got together in Washington and we talked about World War II. There was not one single point that we could agree upon. So, going into a discussion like this, you have to realize that it's half mythologized now. It's been embellished in your own head so that you can't really differentiate the difference between what actually happened and the way it exists now in your own mind. So, dangerous stuff we're playing with here. This is my memory of it. I would guess 18 months or so before the picture actually was cast and began shooting, a fellow by the name of Goldman came to Tucson, Arizona, where I was shooting a film, and we talked there about this script for 6 or 7 evenings over dinner. And then he disappeared and I never heard anything from him. And then I got a call from Steve McQueen. And he said, can you come over to my house? I got the flu. And I said, sure. And he said, there's this script I'd like you to read. And there it was, Butch Cassidy. And I said, that's funny, I've seen this script. In fact, I remember working on it. And so I took it home and read it, and of course it was wonderful. And I called McQueen up and I said, how much are they asking for it? And he said, $350,000. I said, you put in $200,000 and I'll put in $200,000 and we'll buy it this afternoon. And he said, I can't do that. I said, why not? He said, well, there's this guy that's involved and he's an agent and he would have to leave his job, and he won't leave his job until he knows that he will be the producer. I said, fine. That was a Thursday or Friday. Well, it was sold over the weekend.
Tráilers, visita mi canal.
To neither one of us. And so strangely enough, for some reason, that left McQueen out. And of course, I was always thought I would play Sundance. And then George got involved. And he said, no, I thought you always wanted to play Butch. And then another important ingredient, and George will dispute this, and probably has evidence, but it was in my memory that Joanne was the one that suggested Redford for the part originally. But that's what I say. No one knows anymore. But I certainly do remember George's firm, unerring eye on the whole proceedings. He is truly a director in the best sense. When you're cooking, he leaves you alone. When you get in trouble, which is where most directors falter, when you get in trouble, he's the guy that comes in and points you in the right direction. And that, believe me, is very unusual. We had 2 weeks of rehearsal, and I think they went very well. And on the first day of shooting, we shot the railroad car scene. And George says, something has happened between rehearsal and shooting, and what you're doing now is not what you were doing when we came here. I said, what is that, George? And I remember him saying, you're trying to be funny. And you weren't doing that in rehearsal. So that shows you what happens when you get in front of a camera. That film was all there. And the work that had to be done on it, the improvements that the actors and the personalities and their abilities brought to it, was negligible. We didn't have to change much. There were no lines, no scenes that didn't work. I think George had done all of that before we got in front of the camera. And so you don't take as much credit for that, or at least I don't. You might pat yourself more on the back if you'd taken something that was really bad and made it almost good, simply because you started with less and you had to invent more. That film would have been, with different actors in it, probably could have been pretty much the same film, so long as George had been at the helm of it. For a thing like that to work, you really need two charitable actors, actors who have enough sense to give the other one the stage when it's the other person's turn. I think other good actors would have found maybe a little different chemistry, but that would have worked as well too, because George would have found a way to use that chemistry, whatever it was, to the benefit of the film. George had hired a stuntman who came down 2 weeks before we started to shoot. He gave him the bicycle and he said, invent something. The guy came on the day of the shooting and he couldn't do anything. And of course, George is not extravagant. George is frugal. But he was really pissed that this guy had wasted a 2-week stunt thing. And finally, I did all of it, and Connie Hall did one of the shots in it. So we had a terrific time. Except for when George's back went out on him. I came around a corner, and there was George trying to claw his way up the side of a ledge. I said, what the hell are you doing? He said, my back, it's out. I gotta get I gotta hang. I said, hang, and he was trying to get a finger hold on some things so he could take the weight off of his feet. He said, get me over to the tree. And so I turned him around and I got him, and I had my face right into his belly and carried him over to the tree, and he hung. He said, hang from my waist and put some weight on it. And these guys in the crew kept walking by and saying, boy, I wonder what that's all about. There's no saying lying around someplace. Nostalgia ain't what it used to be, but it is. And I'm nostalgic for those days when people shot films. They made films. Now they shoot budgets, they shoot schedules, they shoot somebody's bonus, they shoot a release date. But that film was shot, and that's maybe one of the reasons why it worked. I mean, even to the point where there was a lot of pressure at the end for George to hurry up the distribution, because some southern distributor said that if he got the film earlier, that he could get $1.1 million out of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arizona. But George was living up over in somebody's dressing room so that he wouldn't waste the 20 minutes driving back and forth to work. I mean, he was in the cutting room 12 and 13 and 14 hours a day, and they wanted to release it at 90% of its potential to make a date. And I must say, Zanuck was dragged kicking and screaming, but he finally created an umbrella under which George could hide and not get diverted. I think that carries over time somehow. I suspect it has something to do with delight. The delight of the filmmakers while they were making it. And that's what the film is really about, is delight. All the ingredients have to work. The script has to work, the actors obviously have to work. The camaraderie of it has to be contagious. We had a terrific time.
It was 1967, and the script floated around and somehow came to me with not much chance. The agency, I wasn't that well known at the time, and the agency thought that I'd be very right for it. I read it, and it seemed like a commercial piece, if you could make that determination then. But I can't remember how it really came to me, other than it just floated around and came to me, but I was told almost straight away that, as right as it was for me, that was a long shot because they wanted stars. I was aware that there were a lot of people fighting for me, and I was certainly very moved by that. The studio didn't want me. It was 20th Century Fox, and they wanted 2 stars. I think they wanted Steve McQueen at that time and Paul. And I guess the beauty of the story, and to my fortune, Paul and the writer, and George in particular. George is the one that went to the mat for it. He said, look, it's my movie, I'm the director. And finally, as I understood it, they just kept beating him up, and he beat them up, and they kept forcing him to look at other actors, and they ran out of other actors. I didn't feel in rehearsal that anything special was happening, but I never do. Also, I was too young. At the time, I was only 30 years old, and it was a new experience. It was the first real big film. And I was so much into it as an actor. I was so much into the process of acting and rehearsing that I wasn't able to step aside like maybe the writer could, or even the director, or maybe even Paul, and say, gee, this feels this way or that way. I was too much in the process of developing the character and developing a connection with Paul. Sure, I knew it was a big thing because it was a big movie. It was advertised as a big movie. It was to be changed a fair amount from the movie that I read. The movie that I read did not really have the depth that George brought to it. It was quite jokey. And it was always anachronistic, but that didn't bother me. But I mean, it bothered some critics, but it didn't bother me. But George is the one that really gave it a kind of dimension and breadth. By opening it up, it wasn't quite so much jokes back and forth. You know, he created space for behavior and for character development that I think is what really gave the film that extra lift. My admiration for George Roy Hill. I mean, this guy really had, first of all, he was just perverse enough to make it an interesting experience. I appreciated that. He was wily and wicked and full of surprises and enjoyed being surprised back, so that made it lively and I liked it. But beyond that, George had such discipline for the work. I mean, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He was totally prepared. He has no fat in his films, and I learned a lot from that. He really understands the importance of story. And just working with George, because that was the first real film experience I really had, was a pleasure. And it's got a carry-over resonance for me. Lulu Bettinson. Lulu Bettinson came on the set, Butch's sister. She came on the set and she looked at the situation. She said, okay, she had kind of a squinty eye. The great thing about Lulu, she lived down this little town called Circleville, and she drove over the pass, so to speak, to see us filming in St. George. And she was all tickled to see the horses and the cowboys and everything, but she didn't know what to expect, because how can you tell looking at just a scene being shot? And it was the scene where Harvey Logan gets kicked in the balls by Paul. And so she saw that, and she said, well, is this what the movie's going to be like, you know? And not that it couldn't have happened, but anyway, later, because she was pretty shrewd, she was tough, and the studio didn't want her on the wrong side of things because she was a living relative. They didn't want her stepping up and saying, hey, this didn't happen, or that's not the way it was, or this is nonsense. So they were trying to buy her. And so they were having a hard time. They were trying to get her to the premiere. They wanted to get her to fly back to New Haven, Connecticut. I mean, I think they had it in New Haven because George went to school at Yale, because I wondered what we were doing there, but it had nothing to do with Butch Cassidy. But they were trying to get her there and also get her on board to support the film. And she was like not having any part of it. She said, well, I'll see the film when I see it, and we'll see. And so they wanted to send me in as an emissary because I lived in Utah to talk to her. So there's this big confab in Salt Lake City with the field reps for 20th Century Fox. And most of those field guys in those days, maybe it hasn't changed, just played golf a lot. You know, and suddenly they had all this heat and they had to do something, and they were really panicked. So they said, well, you talk to her, okay? So we all sit in the office, and she says yes, and she's very quiet and very sweet. And she says, well, I don't know. I haven't seen the film. And Mr. Redford seems like a very nice man, but I don't know. I haven't seen the film. And I don't know what I'm going to say. And they said, would you come back to the premiere? Well, I don't know. I've never been on an airplane before, and I don't know that I want to go. So they could see that she was going to be a tough case and wasn't going to be bought too easily by anything. And so finally the guy who got so desperate, he said, but look, you know, we've got, this is a lot of money that we have this, and it's in the can. This film is in the can. And she was like looking for some money. She was like looking, what am I going to get out of this? What are you going to give me to have me go to the premiere and talk nice about the film? And the guy said, well, we can't, you know, you don't understand. The film is in the can. It's done. And she said, oh, okay. She says, well, I'm not in the can. So I knew that she and I were going to get along okay. And we did. I stayed in touch with her and close to her until her death. I went to her home years later. I did a piece for the National Geographic on riding the old outlaw trail, and it ended, the story started up in Casey, Wyoming, and ended there at her place with me talking to her. And she had letters from him when he wrote when he was away. And she was only 6 years old when he left the house. But it was really through the letters and the correspondence that she was able to stay in touch. Now beyond that, there may be myth. I don't know. I like to play practical jokes with people, and I've played some pretty good ones. But that, by far, I would have to say is I had the most with that one. I mean, it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. Because I suddenly realized I'd been completely had over 2 months. 2 months of strategy and 2 months of total sandbag, complete. You just had to love it. I mean, you just had to appreciate it. But there I was, and I thought, well, now wouldn't this be great if I could win? That would make it the best of all. And I almost did. This film was the most fun. I mean, I remember saying at one time, well, I almost felt guilty getting paid for it. It's not quite true. I did have a good time, and working with Paul was great. And we developed a lifelong friendship as a result of it, both professionally and personally. And it was born out of a very natural working relationship, so that was good. And we had so much fun doing it that has to be probably the most fun on any film I've had. I remember Bill Goldman calling me at the time and just being devastated. And he said, I don't believe these sons of bitches. I don't believe these. And then George was even worse. And they took the attitude, the hell with it. The hell with them, the hell with it. And then suddenly the film started to pick up. And of course, they both just happened to be in the neighborhood every day to see if the film was going to be picked up, you know, gain strength. And it did. And within, God, I think about 2 or 3 weeks, it rose past whatever negative criticism there was. It just kind of blew right through it, and that was the end of that. Clearly, the critics missed the chord and very often that happens with critics, is again, you know, they're so busy looking at it either from an intellectual or academic place, they miss what kind of a chord is really being touched with the general public. You know, if it doesn't fit some scheme that they have in mind, they say, oh, this is no good. But the fact is, that whole business about who are those guys just caught on, you know, as the song did. I remember the song got crucified. What's that song? And I wondered what it was doing in the film myself. I said, what's that got to do with anything? Raindrops? Falling on your head? Oh, come on. Well, I was wrong, and critics were wrong. Audiences loved it. I remember the experience of the film coming out, and I was surprised by the kind of success it had, and then it just ran away. It ran into the area of fashion and kind of social. It moved into a whole social strata in our society, and so I wasn't prepared for that at all. As to why, I think it had to do with more than guys running out of time. it had to do with a certain kind of bonding and a certain kind of connection, a real friendship. Whether it's male or female, female, male, male, it doesn't really matter when you can put that on film in a very real way, in a very warm way and an entertaining way. I think it has a lot of currency. So I suspect that had something to do with it. And maybe just Paul and I together, you know. Paul and I are always talking about doing another project. I guess we're both as surprised as anybody else why that hasn't happened, considering Hollywood's penchant for doing sequels. Although he and I were not interested in a sequel to either one of them. They tried to get us to do one of the Sting, Butch Cassidy, and we weren't interested in that. And but we were interested in working together in another picture. So the question is, what would that be? And you would have thought the agency, you know, basically very commerce-minded, would have done something, or the industry itself would have done something, because clearly it was a workable formula, but it just hasn't happened. There's not been a good script that has come our way that we wanted to commit to, but we would like to. This film unquestionably was the film that put me in a new place. I mean, I was known, you know, I'd done Barefoot in the Park and some other films. I'd been on the stage and in the theater, but this is the one that changed my life, where I could no longer live my life the way I had been living normally.
I got to be the straight man. Every comedy, you know, you have to have the straight guy. It's very important, and that really was sort of Etta's part in that. It was frustrating for me. I mean, you know, when everybody's laughing, you want people to laugh at you too, or with you, I guess. And so in a way, it was sort of hard when they had these great lines, and you know, but it was part of the makeup of the whole thing. I believe that it was a good piece of material to begin with. That it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. That it had the elements that it had humor, it had romance, it had tragedy, it had everything in a very nice meld. It had 3 extremely likable characters. It was beautifully photographed. It was extremely well directed. I don't think that you think about creating an effect. I think that you have to take a scene and you have to do it as honestly as you can, given what you have to deal with. You do whatever you have to do, and you hope that it has the effect that you want. And that was what was aimed for in that scene. We totally wanted the audience to be totally surprised at the end of that scene. We wanted them to think that something, I'll say, bad was going to happen. I mean, here's a man with a gun, you know, he's making this girl undress. I mean, is he going to kill her? Is he going to rape her? What's really going to happen? And it had to be totally serious until that very end line. Goldman had said that Etta, you know, that there was always a surprise, but there was a surprise with every character. You know, I mean, every character, there was something that was a little bit different. You know, the most romantic scene that I have is with Butch, and yet I'm Sundance's girlfriend. Sundance, who is supposedly the killer, you know, is afraid, you know, can't swim, you know, and is afraid to jump off the cliff at that moment. So it was a very nice meld of taking these characters, and there were surprises in all of them. And what makes, you know, if we all had sort of the exact formula of what made something appeal to the audiences, you know, we'd all be making great movies all the time. There were 5 or 6 cameras. There were only 4 camera operators. And Conrad said I could operate this camera. This was not in any kind of a key spot for this particular thing. It was an Aeroflex on a McConnell head. I mean, you know, I was just panning across. I had this fantasy of becoming the first woman in the camera union or something, because there weren't any women at that particular moment in time. And I practiced this and practiced doing the shot, just panning these guys along the railroad track. It evidently, I feel very naive, and it was not very bright on my part, but it evidently was upsetting to several people. One of them was the director, who chose not to say anything until after the fact to anybody. And another was, I think, the stuntmen that were riding along the railroad tracks. And I think also some camera operators. They rolled the cameras, I did the shot, and it was the last shot of the day. The set, you know, everyone, the set was wrapped. And George Roy Hill, who I guess had observed all of this going on and had chose to sit by the camera that I was operating and was absolutely furious, only I didn't really realize it at that moment. And he said, "I want to talk to you when we get back to the motel," and the end result was that I was banned from the set, except for when I was working.
Tus tráilers.
And it was
Visita mi canal.
very devastating to me. And in a way, that incident or that action haunted me for the rest of the film. But I think it's in perspective now. I think the parts that I personally enjoyed the most were the improvisational parts. The bike ride, which was a little paragraph in the script, and was one of the musical interludes. And it was a series of shots that were set up by George and Conrad. And Paul and I were we were given kind of a path of action as to where to go with this bicycle. But what we did, we filled in.
Tus tráilers. Visita mi canal.
And it was a lot of fun. Not terribly comfortable on the bicycle, riding through the orchard and so on, but it was, you know, the thing with the cows really sort of just happened, and it was kind of like taking a coloring book and being able to kind of put in the color. And the other, you know, and then down when we were shooting in Mexico and doing the Bolivian sequence, and there was another sequence like that. Anyway, I enjoyed those parts the most. I think, in a way, it goes back to the camera operating incident, because that happened very early on. I had not started shooting. So when you incur the director's wrath before you've even started shooting a film, any time that you can kind of get away from him was really the best part for me. The progression from rehearsals to filming to end product is always surprising. The rehearsals on this particular film, we were sitting around a table, we'd read a bit, we'd talk a lot about whatever was going on, or it would be described what the set was going to look like, or where we were going to be, or something like that. It was rather flat. You get to the filming part of it, and it becomes more. There's more dimension to it. It's kind of like an oil painting. You start off, and you maybe do the background first, and then you layer on something else, and it all begins to take shape and have dimension. I'm always surprised when I see the final product of a film, because there's always more, even though you've been there, you've done it, so to speak, but there is always something more when you're able to see it in an objective way. And there's always a bit of a surprise. I think one of the things that really came out was the humor. Was the first thing in the rehearsal, that you could see the timing of between Redford and Newman. That became better and better as filming went on. you never really know how a movie is going to turn out until it's finally on the screen and you see, and you're always kind of surprised by something, even though you might have been there for every step of it. I'm very proud to have been in a movie that not only people really liked, but it's really a good movie. And so it's...
Y tus trailers, visita mi canal.
So now I like this movie a lot.
One of the reasons I didn't write it as a novel, because I've been a novelist for 10 years before I became a screenwriter, I didn't want to do that kind of research. I don't like horses. I didn't want to know what you'd feed a horse. It's so easy, basically, just say they mount up and ride off, rather than talking about how you saddle a horse and all that shit. So I never wanted to write it as a novel. I just basically, one of the things about it is that other technicians take care of that stuff. I had no idea it would be a movie, you understand, when I wrote it. I'd never written an original screenplay before, and there was a pressure. I was teaching at Princeton. It was I can't think of the year, 67, 68, I guess, and I wrote it over Christmas vacation in my office at Princeton University. I was teaching only that 1 year, and then it went out and it was turned down by everybody. And I didn't do. I was working with a producer who was very helpful, named Larry Turman. And then I did a rewrite that didn't have much change, and everybody wanted it, and then Fox bought it. It was originally called The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy, which I like better. And when Newman took the other part, the title shifted. And what made it a fabulous story for me was that they went to South America, because that was what was revelatory and different and fresh. And they didn't stand and fight, and they ran away. I mean, it was tricky for me because I'm aware there's a 27-minute chase in the middle, and that's only there to try and to justify why they went away, because I wanted the audience to want them to go away, because in those days that was radical. John Wayne didn't do that. Gary Cooper did not run. He stood and he fought, and no matter what the odds were, he did that because that's what brave men did. And so Butch, in a sense, did a miraculous thing. In real life, as you probably know, there was a super posse that Harriman got. They never chased them, because the minute Butch heard about the super posse and who was on it, he got the hell out, because he had no chance against those people. I still love the story. I still find them, they're a captivating, Cassidy was a fascinating figure. I mean, we really don't know much about the Sundance Kid, except he was born in New Jersey. And his name was Harry Longbaugh, and he was apparently miraculous with a gun. And we know that Etta Place, we have pictures of Etta Place, and she was beautiful. And I choose to think she was a school teacher and not a whore, which a lot of people think, because it was such a tough life out there. I just don't think anybody that stunningly pretty could have lived as a whore. The most skillful screenwriting I've ever done in my life was the character of Etta, because I hate women in action movies because they can't do anything except for Sigourney Weaver and Alien. And she didn't happen at that point. So what I did with Etta very consciously, every scene she's in, she gives a surprise. She's the girlfriend, not the school teacher. She knows who the super posse is. She speaks Spanish. She teaches them the language. She's leaving because they're going to die. Everything she does, she's never there saying, oh, be careful. She's basically in it, and that was hard. Giving her a surprise each time was hard, and that was very conscious. It's still painful when you finish a piece and you give it to a director, and you know they're going to alter it. They can make it better, they can make it worse, but it won't be what's in your head. There's still that moment of, oh, I wish they wouldn't do that. But that's just that's like a woman having a baby or something. You know, there's a sadness as well as a joy. I mean, George happened to be a proper director for that material, and did wonderful work with it. But very few guys today can do that. Very few people can do action and comedy. George was good at comedy. George was an actor, and George was a very successful Broadway director and television director before he got into it. And so George's inclination is always, George, for example, I don't think George ever fired a writer. I mean, once he made that choice, he would stay with that writer. And also, he always felt his job was to make the script work. And a lot of guys can't do that. They aren't willing to do it. They don't know how to do it. And sometimes they're right not to try and do it. I mean, we had a wonderful work experience that summer. It was odd. I went out from New York, where I live, to California, and we met. My memory is, we met every day for 2 months, and we went over and over and over and over the script, not altering it much. And he's just going over it and over and over it, I think, in his head. And what does this scene like? It's a wonderful experience that you almost never get, talking with someone, going over and over and over the script till the director gets it in his head. Because one of the reasons movies fuck up
tráilers,
is because I'm
visita
riding
mi
apples
canal.
and you're directing oranges. And no one told us that. It's not out of malice often. It's just because we never said, oh, this scene was meant to be funny. I didn't get that. And the basic problem we all have with Butch, forget if it would work, but I mean, that's obviously always the problem. But was it too funny so you wouldn't give a shit about them when they die? And that was always the balance. It's always a hard, when you're dealing with comedy and drama, finding the proper balance is brutal. That's always the hardest thing. And then we had 2 fabulous weeks of rehearsal. The first week with just the 3 principals. And then the second week we brought in Connie. And it was, I mean, we got so much ironed out in those 2 weeks. And it worked. It was a wonderful period for all of us. I remember George and I, Catherine, Ross, they all used to come in jeans and T-shirts. And Catherine, I guess, is as pretty as anybody I've ever seen in my life. And Redford's nice looking, and Newman's amazing looking. And I remember George and I, at the end of rehearsal, we would say, we feel so ugly. Because there were just the 5 of us in this huge room. And the script person, the script guy was there. But it was just, I mean, these wonderful looking human beings. When a movie works, it's really a miracle, because there are so many reasons why it shouldn't. There are so many people pulling in different directions, and so many... It's very hard to know what direction you're going. Are we going northeast on this picture? Is that the spot? Are we going there? A lot of movies get screwed up in shooting because you think, oh, this works, I'll go with this, and all of a sudden you've affected the balance of the movie. You're not going northeast anymore, you're suddenly going south. And you just screwed it up entirely. I mean, a lot of pictures just get screwed up that way. I've been involved with some. You don't know quite what you're doing. It's very tricky. The shooting is a very unpleasant part of the movie. I don't like to be around. It's so boring. I get very nervous. The money that's being spent is so awful. I'm compulsive about time. And I hate it when things drag on or are late, and the repeating and repeating. There's no job for the writer. I won't say I'm wrong on this. I just think basically almost no one agrees with me. In my head, I'm a novelist who happens to write screenplays. I've done that work. I know the screenplay by heart. I think I make the actors nervous. And there's no work for me there. Everybody else has a reason for being there. And it's like agony for me to be on the set. If there's work, it's fine, but there's not for the most part. You know, the actors are trying to make something of the script that they've been handed. And it's just not a place. I don't have any desire to be a director or producer. If I did, I'd want to be there and I'd try and learn as much as I did. But I've always hated being on the set. I was there for the week in the middle where they shot the whorehouse sequence. And George flew me out, and I saw all the dailies. And he wanted to know if it was okay, and of course it was wonderful. There's this fabulous shot where they're being chased and they're riding, and then they disappear. And then they come up, and they disappear again. And then they come up another, and it's just this marvelous shot of them, and it's just extraordinary. And I remember I screamed when I saw it. It's a wonderfully acted movie. The 2 men are wonderful. They didn't get Newman, as I say, got no reviews. It was like he was just being himself, ho, ho, ho. And Redford got reviews, didn't get, you know, as so much acting as mythic reviews. And there was a lot of trouble during the shooting because Redford was so clearly sensational in the picture. And a lot of the Newman people said, don't give him so many close-ups. And Newman could not, Newman was thrilled. He's one of those people who, a lot of actors want to be surrounded by bad actors. But Newman always liked having wonderful actors around because he knew they made him better. The two scenes are when they're payroll guards in South America and the guy gets shot. They have a scene. They're hiding behind a rock, and the Mexican bandits are shooting at them. And they have a scene about what are they doing there. And the other scene was a scene where Etta leaves, and that's a long scene where they're in a tent watching a movie, and that must be 3-4 minutes, and it ends with them watching themselves getting killed in this 1911 two-reeler, and Etta moving away, and then back to them and back to her, and back. I mean, it's about their dying, and also it's about legends, and both the introspection scene by the rock, and the scene when she leaves were essentially because we're dealing with legendary people, and they're different from the rest of us, and how did they get that way, and what do they know about what they were doing, all that stuff. As I say, the movie that I wrote was darker. I was not at the first sneak, I think in San Francisco, and George called me in despair. And I remember, I think he said they laughed at my baby, or something like that. And he said they just laughed too much. And so he went through the movie taking out laughs. You know, we're talking about a movie that's 25 years old, and I would guess in 25 more years it will be just as valid as it is now, however valid that is. And I have no idea why. I mean, I remember it was such a strange hit, and it had such an impact on kids in the late 60s and 70s, early 70s. I remember there was a whole theory at the time that it was about the Vietnam War, that the super posse was the government and Lyndon Johnson coming to get you and Richard Nixon, and that Butch and Sundance were these people trying. And I have no, you know, I was staggered when I heard that theory, but I heard it from a lot of people. No one has any idea why it's popular. Except the reviews were so terrible, and we thought it was a flop. And, well, the reviews were awful in New York. There wasn't one review that you could reprint in its entirety. And Pauline Kael, who was a person who wrote for the New Yorker, I remember her review was entitled The Bottom of the Pit. And the reviews were just uniformly bad. Some of them were like 2.5 stars, that kind of thing, out of 4, or maybe 3 stars out of 4. And I remember the day before, George and I were doing a hype thing. They had a bunch of composers in that we had to talk to the day we opened, I think, or the day after we opened. And it was a shitty, rainy day, and I remember they were asking George questions like, did Burt Bacharach intentionally steal the score from Fellini's something or other? And it was just awful. And we walked over to the theater. It was playing at the Sutton and on 57th Street. And we walked over, and we said, should we go in? And the manager was happily smiling, and he said, business is wonderful, and the audience loved it. And we said, how's it doing on Broadway? He said, I don't know, I'll find out. And he said, it's doing wonderfully there, too. And then it was raining, it was drizzling, and George had an office at 57th, and I went uptown, he went downtown. And I remember one of us said to the other, maybe it's not a disaster. And that was how we thought of it. I never saw it. We had one big sneak in New York, months and months, like 1,500 people. And it died. It was all business people, and it just lay there because all anybody was wondering was it going to do any business? And nobody got. I never saw the movie for like 7 years until it was reissued. It was so horrible watching it that one time. So I've only seen it really twice. And then I saw it. It was like Gilbert and Sullivan the second time because it had become part of the culture, and all the kids knew the lines, and everybody was saying the lines before the audience did, and it was terrific.
Never met George Roy Hill until that day that I walked in to take a meeting with him where he was playing Bach. So it was very intimidating for any composer to walk in to meet a director that you might be working with, and having him play very, very well too. Just learning Bach, but really playing quite well. I don't think that George was doing that on purpose. I think George I think just George was playing the piano waiting for me to show up. Yeah, I'd like to think that he wouldn't do something like that on purpose. I think that George, very straight,
tus
very honest
trailers,
guy.
visita mi
No
canal.
games like that. George was very, very specific about the use of music in Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. He wanted the music to be special. When it was used, it was to have a real, like, important place in the majority of that score. It wasn't to be filler music. It wasn't to be to help the story along. It was like, of course it helps the story along if it's right, but it was to be, have importance, like the bicycle sequence, like the trip to South America, that whole montage. The theme for the bicycle sequence was a piece of music that I just kept watching that scene on my Moviola machine, and I got this theme. And I thought it could be maybe a song. I didn't know how oppositional George would be about a song there. He was a little bit. But we wrote it, Hal David and myself wrote it, and I explained to him that it would go as far and then it could go, become an instrumental take-off variation departure on the melody. And he kind of went into it, I don't think 100%, but I think he did get to see and appreciate that. That was very dangerous. It was a very dangerous call on George's part, my part. Could have been very disruptive for that picture if it didn't work. But it worked. It was beautiful. It was a great story, great picture, great screenplay, great directed, great performances, and I think I wrote a pretty good score.
Also, Paul, it was my understanding at the time that he couldn't make up his mind which part to play.
I would have played either part, and I really didn't care.
I thought the acting in Butch, we could tell that in rehearsal. Rehearsal was wonderful.
Rehearsals were sitting around a table and reading a bit and discussing, and you know, had a rather flat quality.
The reality was, Redford was already getting star offers during that rehearsal period.
No, I wasn't. I got offered. That didn't come until the movie was screened. Or we were in the latter part of filming, not during rehearsals.
Newman was bothered by the scene when they see themselves in a movie, and he said, I'm going to do it leaning against the tent wall, by which he meant he wanted not to be in the scene.
Really? I'd rather think of myself as a little soldier, you know? Go over there, okay, boss.
I was not at the first sneak. It was, I think, in San Francisco, and George called me in despair. And I remember, I think he said they laughed at my baby.
People went wild. They went nuts. It was a great, great feeling. The applause was unbelievable at the beginning, unbelievable under the credits. And they loved the bicycle sequence. I just felt so great when I came out.
Like two movies I've been involved with, this and The Princess Bride. So I have very little bad to say about this movie. I thought it was wonderful. I think it was a terrific play.
Everybody got along. Everybody got along great, I think. Newman was always telling jokes. Redford was always on the phone, and I was always waiting for them.
True, there were gags played, jokes played, everybody kidding each other, working hard, always working on the script, pushing against it, and enjoying the work.
We had a terrific time. It's one of a kind. And as a composer, maybe you just get one of those in your lifetime, if you're lucky.